Every coastal town has its anchor. In Harborview, it was Frank Morrison's corner booth at the Marine's Rest Diner. The brass bell rattled as Frank entered, shoulders squared despite 70 years, steps measured and sure. Salt air mixed with bacon grease. 5:47 a.m. meant his spot waited. Back corner, Harborview, watching fishing boats return. "Morning, Frank," Rosa called, reaching for coffee. Frank nodded, settling into worn vinyl, placing his Tribune beside the sugar. His navy work shirt stayed buttoned tight, but where fabric pulled across his chest, a thin ribbon showed, faded red, white, and blue silk catching early light. The shirt looked older than the diner's jukebox, salt-stained and mended, carrying untold stories. Same paper, same booth, same Glenn Miller cycling softly. Black coffee, wheat toast, 2 eggs, $4.50 under his napkin, always. At 5:52, kitchen doors banged. "Memorial Day weekend!" shouted Rick Bradley, day manager, clipboard in hand. "We're gonna be slammed!" That ribbon shimmered, waiting. If you believe every veteran deserves respect regardless of age, type "honor" below and let us know where you're watching from. Frank Morrison never explained the ribbon. Not to Rosa, who'd served him coffee for 6 years. Not to the breakfast regulars who nodded respectfully but never asked questions. The Distinguished Service Cross ribbon, thin as paper, weightier than gold, pressed against his chest through worn cotton. Most people wouldn't recognize it. Most people weren't supposed to. Rosa approached with the coffee pot, steam curling like harbor fog. Her eyes caught the ribbon's edge. Red stripe, white stripe, blue stripe, each color faded but brilliant. "My grandfather had a ribbon like that," she said, refilling his cup. Never talked about it either. Frank's hand paused over his newspaper. The Tribune's headline read, "Memorial Day Ceremony Honors Harborview Heroes." Below it, Admiral James Mitchell, guest speaker, retired Pacific Fleet commander. "Different war," Frank said quietly, turning the page. But Rosa noticed how his fingers lingered on the article, how his breathing changed reading Mitchell's name, how Frank's jaw tightened like a man hearing thunder before the storm. In the kitchen, dishwasher Pete Carlson peered through the service window. 63, Navy veteran himself, he'd been watching Frank for months. Recognizing something in how the older man carried himself. The automatic room sweep when entering. The positioning with clear sight lines to exits. Pete had seen that bearing before, in officers. In men who'd carried weight others couldn't imagine. The ribbon caught light again as Frank reached for coffee. For 1 second, Pete saw it clearly. Red, white, blue silk with a tiny bronze star at its center. His breath caught. He knew that ribbon. Knew what it meant. Knew fewer than 2,000 men in American history had ever worn one. Frank Morrison wasn't just a regular customer. He was something else entirely. Tuesday mornings followed the same pattern for 6 years. Frank finished eggs at 6:15, folded his napkin with military precision, left payment under the coffee cup. He nodded to Rosa, tipped his invisible hat to Mrs. Chen, reading by the window, stepped back into salt air. But today was different. As Frank reached the door, Rosa called softly, "Frank, you going to the ceremony Friday?" He paused, one hand on the brass handle worn smooth under countless fishermen's palms. "Hadn't planned on it." "Admiral Mitchell's speaking. Heard he served in the Pacific." Frank's shoulders tensed, just slightly, just enough for someone trained to read bodies disciplined by time. "Different ocean," he said, pushing through the door. Rosa watched him walk toward the harbor, noting how he moved, not with age's shuffle, but with measured gait of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for when it mattered. 20 minutes later, Rick Bradley burst through kitchen doors like a man late for his own wedding. 28, managing the Marine's Rest with frantic energy, convinced enthusiasm could substitute for experience. "Rosa! We need uniforms for Memorial Day weekend. Corporate wants everyone looking sharp for ceremony crowds." Rosa poured herself coffee, knowing where this headed. "What about Frank?" "Frank?" Rick blinked. "The dishwasher? What about him?" "He's been here 6 years, Rick. Never called sick, never complained, never caused trouble." Rick pulled out his phone, scrolling uniform policy emails. Corporate says all employees need proper Marines rest attire. No personal clothing during special events. That includes whatever that old shirt thing is. That shirt is clean and pressed every day. But it's not company standard. Look, Rosa, I get it. Frank's nice, but image matters, especially with Navy brass coming. We can't have staff looking like they wandered from the docks. Rosa set down her cup with force. Frank Morrison has more dignity in his little finger than most people have entirely. I'm sure he's dignified, Rick said, not looking up, but he's representing the Marines' rest. Proper uniforms, or he finds somewhere else to work. The diner fell silent except for coffee makers' rhythmic gurgling and distant seagulls. Even Mrs. Chen glanced up from her novel. In the kitchen, Pete Carlson gripped the sink until his knuckles went white. That ribbon, that bearing, that quiet dignity. Rick Bradley had no idea what he was threatening to destroy. Friday morning arrived gray and windswept. Memorial Day weekend beginning with weather that made harbor towns feel eternal. Salt spray, crying gulls, steady rhythm of waves against weathered pilings. Frank Morrison entered the Marines' Rest at 5:47, just like always. Instead of his usual Navy work shirt, he wore his only other shirt, faded denim, carefully pressed, with that thin DSC ribbon pinned exactly where it had been for 6 years. The diner buzzed with unusual energy. Extra tables, special menus, red, white, and blue bunting across windows. Rosa moved between customers with practiced efficiency, eyes tracking Frank to his booth. Rick Bradley appeared from the back office, clipboard in hand, wearing a crisp new Marines Rest polo. He stopped seeing Frank. "Frank, good morning." Rick's voice carried forced cheer. "Listen, I need to talk about that." His eyes landed on the ribbon. Frank continued buttoning his sleeve, not looking up. "About what?" "The ribbon. Corporate policy says no personal insignia during special events. You'll need to remove it." The diner didn't go silent, too busy, but Rosa felt sound quality change. Conversations continued, but tension underneath, like air pressure dropping before storm. Frank finished his sleeve and looked up. Gray eyes steady, calm, completely unreadable. "This ribbon stays where it is." Rick shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Frank, I don't want this difficult. We've got Navy brass coming today. Admiral Mitchell himself might stop by. We need professional." "Professional," Frank repeated, voice flat. "Right. So if you could just—" Rick reached toward Frank's chest. Frank's hand moved faster than his age should have allowed, catching Rick's wrist in a grip gentle but absolutely immovable. "Don't!" The word carried weight having nothing to do with volume. Rick froze, suddenly aware the quiet dishwasher had demonstrated strength and reflexes belonging to someone very different. Frank released Rick's wrist and stood slowly. "This ribbon represents men who died, so you could have opinions about dress codes. It stays where it is." "Fine," Rick said, voice rising. "Then maybe you should find somewhere else to work. Somewhere that appreciates vintage military fashion." Frank Morrison looked at Rick Bradley for a long moment. Then he nodded once, picked up his newspaper, and walked toward the door. The brass bell rattled behind him like distant thunder. Pete Carlson found Frank Morrison sitting on the seawall behind the diner, looking out at the harbor where fishing boats bobbed like toys. The Distinguished Service Cross ribbon caught morning light, red and white and blue against faded denim. "Mind if I sit?" Pete asked. Frank gestured to weathered concrete beside him. For several minutes, they watched boats in comfortable silence. Two old men understanding some conversations required patience. "I recognize that ribbon," Pete said finally. Frank's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Do you?" "DSC, Distinguished Service Cross, second highest decoration for valor. Bronze star in center means multiple awards." Pete paused. "Means you saw serious action." Frank said nothing, but his breathing changed, the way it does when someone touches a wound that never quite healed. "I was Navy," Pete continued. "USS Hornet, 73 to 78. Never saw combat like you, but I knew men who had. Knew what that ribbon cost." Harbor fog was lifting, revealing staging area for Memorial Day ceremony. Workers moved around the small platform like ants preparing for something larger. Operation Neptune, Frank said quietly. Spring of 1968. Saigon had fallen apart, North Vietnamese everywhere, civilians trapped in embassy district. Pete waited. They sent 8 of us in, extract 67 American personnel and families. Intelligence said light resistance, in and out 6 hours. Frank's fingers found the ribbon unconsciously. Intelligence was wrong. A seagull landed nearby, eyeing them hopefully. Frank reached into his pocket and scattered toast crumbs from breakfast. We held that embassy 36 hours. 67 people became 123 when we found other families. 8 men became 4, then 2. Frank's voice stayed level, but hands no longer quite steady. By the time extraction arrived, just me and Private Morrison, same last name, no relation. Kid from Ohio, 19, kept telling jokes even when mortars were falling. Pete noticed how Frank's eyes tracked every boat in harbor, every person moving on docks. Old habits. Morrison took shrapnel in chest during final assault, lung puncture, losing blood fast. Couldn't carry him and civilians both. Frank's fingers tightened on ribbon. He made me choose. Frank stood slowly, brushing concrete dust from jeans. Take the families, Sergeant, he said. That's what we came for. A kid was 19, smarter than officers twice his age. They gave me his DSC along with mine, Frank said. Told me I'd earned both. But Morrison's the one who should be wearing this. Morrison's the one who deserves honor. So you wear it for him. Frank nodded. Every day. Because somebody has to remember. By 10 a.m., word had spread through Harbor View's veteran community like wildfire through dry grass. Pete Carlson had made 3 phone calls, and those 3 calls became 30. At Lighthouse Hardware, Korean War veteran Sam Murphy stopped restocking screws and called his nephew at VFW. At Harbor View Marina, Vietnam-era Marine Sergeant Gloria Patterson put down her clipboard and dialed American Legion. At Coast Guard Station, retired Master Chief Torres heard the story and reached for his secure phone. The name Frank Morrison began circulating through networks existing below civilian life. Networks built from shared experience, mutual respect, unbreakable bonds forged by those who'd worn the uniform. Meanwhile, Frank sat in his small apartment above Kelly's bait shop, staring at newspaper article about Memorial Day ceremony. Admiral James Mitchell's photograph looked back, stern face with eyes that had seen command responsibility, decorated with ribbons telling their own stories. Frank knew those eyes, had served under men with those eyes. Trusted them with his life and lives of civilians who'd depended on him to bring them home. The DSC ribbon lay on his kitchen table, temporarily unpinned while he decided what came next. After 6 years of dishwashing, 6 years of quiet routine, 6 years of carrying Morrison's memory in peaceful anonymity, that life was over. A knock at his door interrupted thoughts. "Frank, it's Rosa. Can we talk?" He opened the door to find not just Rosa, but Pete Carlson and 3 men he didn't recognize, all wearing various military insignia, VFW caps, and bearing that marked them as family. "Frank Morrison," said the oldest, a man in his 70s with Navy anchor pins. "Master Chief Torres, retired. I've been looking forward to meeting you for 30 years. Frank's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Master Chief. Operation Neptune," Torres said simply. "Saved my nephew's family. Jennifer Torres, age 6 at the time, her mother, grandmother. They were in that embassy when hell broke loose." Silence stretched between them like a bridge being built one word at a time. "Jennifer's a doctor now," Torres continued. "Pediatric surgeon in San Diego, 3 kids of her own. She's lived a whole life because you and Private Morrison chose to stay when everyone else was pulling out." Rosa stepped forward. "Frank, there's something else. Rick's been making calls all morning, trying to get you blacklisted. Says you're difficult and won't follow company policy." Frank's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Torres smiled, the kind suggesting storms were coming for those who deserved them. "Funny thing about small towns," Torres said. "Word travels fast. And Rick Bradley just learned about 60% of his weekend customers are veterans or military families." Memorial Day morning dawned crisp and clear. the kind of spring day that made coastal Maine feel like the edge of the world. Harbor View's small downtown bustled with activity as families headed toward Marina for ceremony. The Marines' Rest Diner sat conspicuously empty. Rick Bradley stood behind counter, staring at room after room of vacant tables. Red, white, and blue bunting looked festive and forlorn, like decorations for a party nobody attended. "Rosa," he called to Kitchen. "Where is everyone?" Rosa emerged with a coffee pot she had no one to serve. "They're at the ceremony, Rick. But they always stop here first. The veterans, families. This is tradition." Through window, Rick could see streams of people walking past the diner toward harbor. Some glanced through glass, but nobody slowed. Nobody reached for door handle. At Kelly's bait shop, Frank Morrison's apartment had been transformed into impromptu command center. Master Chief Torres coordinated with VFW Honor Guard. Pete Carlson helped arrange folding chairs borrowed from American Legion. Rosa had arrived with coffee and homemade biscuits. Frank sat in center of it all, wearing his pressed denim shirt with DSC ribbon precisely positioned, looking simultaneously overwhelmed and completely at ease. For the first time in 6 years, he wasn't hiding. "Admiral's ETA is 20 minutes, Torres announced, checking his watch with precision of a man who'd spent decades synchronizing operations across time zones. "Frank," Rosa said quietly, settling beside him. "You okay?" Frank nodded, but his fingers found ribbon unconsciously. "Haven't talked about Morrison in a long time. You don't have to talk about anything you don't want to." "No," Frank said, voice growing stronger. "Morrison deserves to be remembered, today especially." Outside, sounds of gathering ceremony drifted up from harbor. Navy band warming up, children laughing, general murmur of community coming together to honor its fallen. Frank had attended ceremonies before, but always from edges, always anonymous. A black sedan pulled up outside Kelly's bait shop, government plates catching morning sun. Through apartment window, Frank watched Admiral James Mitchell emerge, a man in his 60s, wearing dress blues with ribbon bars telling stories of 3 decades naval service. Torres snapped to attention. "Admiral on deck." The room responded with automatic precision of men trained to respect rank, even in retirement. The Harbor View Memorial Day ceremony had never seen anything like it. Admiral James Mitchell stood at podium, but his prepared speech lay forgotten. Instead, he spoke from 30 years of reading classified reports, of understanding what heroism looked like when nobody was watching. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Admiral said, voice carrying across Marina, "today I want to tell you about Operation Neptune and about 2 soldiers who embodied the very best of American military service." The crowd of 300 fell silent. Families, veterans, children holding small flags, Coast Guard personnel in dress uniforms. Even seagulls seemed to quiet. In spring of 1968, 8 soldiers were tasked with extracting American personnel from an embassy under siege. When they arrived, they found not 67 people, but 123. Families who had nowhere else to go, children who couldn't be left behind. Frank Morrison sat in front row, flanked by Master Chief Torres and Pete Carlson. The DSC ribbon on his chest caught harbor breeze, red and white and blue silk that seemed to shimmer with its own light. For 36 hours, those 8 soldiers held position against overwhelming odds. One by one, they gave their lives to protect the innocent. By final assault, only 2 remained, Sergeant Frank Morrison and Private David Morrison, no relation except bond forged by shared sacrifice. In the crowd, Rick Bradley stood at very back, having closed the empty diner. His face had gone pale as he began understanding exactly who he'd fired. Private Morrison was mortally wounded during final extraction, Admiral Mitchell continued. With enemy forces closing in, Sergeant Morrison faced impossible choice: save his fellow soldier or save the families they'd been sent to protect. Harbor fell so quiet that waves against pilings seemed loud as thunder. Private Morrison made the choice for him. "Take the families, Sergeant," he said. "That's what we came for." He died at his post, rifle ready, protecting an empty building because that's what soldiers do. Admiral Mitchell paused, letting weight of story settle over crowd like fog rolling from Atlantic. Sergeant Morrison carried 67 civilians 3 miles through enemy territory to extraction point. Then he went back for his friend, found Private Morrison exactly where he'd left him, faithful to duty until the end. Frank Morrison stood slowly, movement drawing every eye in Marina. Admiral Mitchell stepped down from podium and approached. "For 67 people, Sergeant Morrison was deliverance," the Admiral said. "For Private Morrison, he was honor fulfilled. For our nation, he represents the very best of what it means to serve." The Admiral stopped in front of Frank, came to attention, and rendered a salute so precise it could have been carved from marble. Frank Morrison returned the salute with movements that spoke of muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. The crowd rose as one. 300 people stood in spontaneous tribute. "This ribbon doesn't belong to me," Frank said, voice somehow carrying across silent Marina. "It belongs to Private David Morrison, who taught me that some promises are worth dying for." He touched the DSC ribbon gently. "I wear it because somebody has to remember. Thank you to everyone who typed honor. Your support honors every veteran who has served with dignity like Frank Morrison. These stories of quiet heroism need to be told. If you believe in sharing tales of unsung heroes, please subscribe to help us honor more incredible veterans. Until next time, remember that true dignity can never be defeated.